How about now? Let's test this. How about now? Let's test this. Excellent, that's good. Okay, so let's wait for a few people to sign on. Try not to be too noisy there. How about now? Let's test this. Turn off my my own stream. So, okay, I'll just get started and other people can catch up. What I want to talk about today is this book, which I wrote, gosh, a year ago, 2 years ago now. And here we go. I want to talk about it from the standpoint of the viability of the lineage as a basis for religious practice. Now, you know, in contrast to this, I want to talk about two other religions. Christianity is an obvious one, very prominent, and I also want to talk about paganism and sort of the I don't want to say the problems with paganism, but one of the big impediments I think a lot of people have with paganism, particularly of the sort of Nordic and Greek varieties, which I'm more familiar with, particularly the Greek one. So with religions generally, the purpose of a religion is to give your life some direction. You know, there's the famous line from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, where Alice is walking around and the Cheshire Cat asks, you know, oh well, she asked the cat, what's the best way to go? And the cat asks, well, it depends on where you want to end up. She says, I don't much care where I end up. Well, then it doesn't matter which way you go. Religions are about provide, and all religions do this, are about providing a vision of the good to pursue and also of the bad to avoid. So with Christianity, what is the vision of the good in Christianity? Well, it imagines this being called God, which is basically an amalgamation of all positive attributes imaginable to their highest conceivable degree. So he is maximally good, he's maximally loving, he's maximally just, but also maximally merciful. Never mind the difficulties that can bring up, and so forth. And it says this is the good, be like him, but not completely. And there's a big asterisk there. But that's the basis. That's the aesthetic basis, and it is a very eschatological vision. By that I mean it's a very linear. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we're moving towards the end. Paganism provides a very different vision of what the good is. Paganism provides, there's this God over here, which is about justice, but then there's this other God over here, which is about power, and there's this other God over here, which is just about chariots, or whatever the case may be, or boats. And then there's this goddess of the hearth, and this other god of the fields, and so forth. And the pagan view is not so much just an amalgamation of the extreme end of good and go that way, but it conceives of the universe as many different sources of power in the world. Maybe the ocean is one that you need to account for. Maybe the sky is one you need to account for, be that Yahweh or Zeus or Thor or what have you. And then the good from the pagan view is about pursuing a kind of balance in being mindful of these different gods. And you might have your own special god, like maybe you people of Athens have a particular affinity for Athena. Etymologically makes sense. And that kind of thing. Maybe you and your little group are all about Thor. Or maybe you in your Japanese village are all about this one very particular Shinto forest demon that is associated with the forest on the outskirts of town. And you're all about caring for, I say demon, I should say spirit, about caring for and being mindful of that spirit, because the forest is where you get your wood, which is what keeps the economy going, and it's also where you hunt to get food, and whatever the case may be. And the gods of paganism are not supernatural. The supernatural deities are a particularly Middle Eastern thing, we'll say. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Those are the religions of supernatural deities. And this confuses a lot of Christians who have a hard time grappling with the non-supernatural nature of pagan deities. They almost don't seem like gods because they're so used to gods being supernatural almost by definition. But anyways, those are the two framing points, the points of reference that I want to talk about an alternative. Namely this, or the book that you can hopefully see in the left-hand side there anyways. And that's this concept of the Anwei. What is the Anwei exactly? What is this entity we're talking about? I came up with the term Anwei because it was really, really cumbersome to keep saying lineage spirit over and over and over again. It was very cumbersome. So Anwei was a nice, pithy little word. It comes from the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European terms for animate or animate, anima, which is like a spirit. It's where we get animal and animate from, etymologically. And way, which is just like us. It's we. It's where we get we from. So it's the spirit of us. It is the sort of underlying character that survives through the passage of generations along particular lines. And obviously, it's not a very clear thing. You know, it changes over time. But so do we. And the changes that we undergo, we don't really feel like the same people at 30 as we felt like when we were 3, for example. So, and that doesn't stop us from maintaining a coherent sense of identity from our 3-year-old self to our 30-year-old self. And it's, even though we are, for all intents and purposes, completely different animals at that point, in every regard, really. And so in that way, I think it does make sense to think of the Anwei as a coherent spirit, as a coherent being, and as, in terms of religious terminology, as a god. And by a god, I mean a thing that is worthy of worship. Now, anyone who's been to, Christian Sunday services for more than a few years will know that we worship a lot of things that we don't think of actively as gods, but nevertheless are gods. And the classic Christian examples are always vices. So like money is a big one, fame, career success, and so forth. And it is in that sense, and those are all legitimate, we'll say deities. They can have a personality, and I talk a little bit about this in another book I have, Holy Nihilism. There's a whole section in there about the nature of gods in this ways and the alternative conceptualizations of what gods can be other than just supernatural entities. But the deity I'm talking about in this case is this this spirit of the lineage, this Anwei, the spirit of us. And my argument for choosing this as a basis, not as your exclusive or only deity, but as sort of a primary and centering and grounding one, has to do with the fact that, well, first of all, belief in its existence, I argue on the basis of, first of all, the reality of death. And second of all, the peculiar phenomenon of suicide. And let me talk a little bit about those two. There are animals in the world that are biologically immortal. And what that means is that every year, the odds of them dying are like a dice roll with the same dice. Now, that doesn't sound necessarily very immortal, but when you think about it, what that's saying is that they don't age. If left to their own devices in more or less the same environment, they could theoretically live forever. And there are animals like the Greenland shark is one example. There are some sea turtles that come pretty close. There are some jellyfish and some flatworms. And there are a few species of trees that come really are biologically immortal. Bristlecone pine being probably the most prominent example. California redwoods and giant sequoias not terribly far behind. And there's one creature in particular, I don't know, creature is not the right term, but a tree, a root system for Rocky Mountain aspens in Colorado that is estimated to be, they estimate at least 80,000 years old. And it is a single organism. You can look up Old Pando, Pando. And so there are organisms out there that can live more or less forever, but humans are not one of them. Humans seem to be designed to die, and I'm using that phrasing, designed to die, because I'm borrowing it from a man named Aubrey de Grey. Aubrey de Grey is a would-be transhumanist. He is trying to live forever, and is one of the people who seems to be most serious about that. And he's talked about the human body, comparing it to an automobile, and a lot of the processes of aging that we think of as diseases, things like cancer and Alzheimer's, he says these aren't actually diseases in the normal sense. What they are natural byproducts of the body's own metabolic processes. So we are literally born, we are made with a shelf life, and we are designed to expire at a certain point. Now, from a biological standpoint, why would nature do this? You know, we're told that nature is about survival of the fittest. So dying doesn't seem very evolutionarily advantageous. But of course, evolution doesn't happen without death. And evolution is not just about change, it's about maintenance and improvement of the organism. So our death, within the context of the lineage, is a survival tool for the lineage as its own organism. So our genetic programming is not totally designed for our benefit, except insofar as it is beneficial to the greater organism of the lineage. So the question then becomes, well, why should we care about that? You know, just because something is doesn't mean it's necessarily good, or that we should build our lives around it. That's what philosophers often talk about as the naturalistic fallacy. But when you look at the societies around the world that not only are the happiest, but who also live the longest, ironically, they are the societies that have the closest connection with that lineage, with that spirit of the lineage. And they are connected in a manner that is alive. They have a relationship with this spirit, to borrow from Christian theology a little bit. I shouldn't say that. Other religious traditions have that too. Christianity tries to claim credit for it, but yeah. So they are living in connection with their ancestors, and you can see this in China. This is it's not terribly far off from Confucianism, what I'm talking about here. I think I talk about Confucianism a little bit in the book, actually. And what I'm trying to do is not just claim personal credit for, old religious systems. I'm trying to reverse engineer a little bit why these variety of religious systems, Confucianism being only one example. There are many other ancestor worship type religions out there. And ancestor worship is actually an oversimplification of what we're talking about, because it's not just about the ancestors. It's your ancestors as avatars of this greater being that is the lineage of which you are a part. It's not even just your family, because your family is a temporal and immediate thing, and this lineage stretches forward and backward ad infinitum. And you are the living avatar of it, though not the only one, and the temporary caretaker of its health and reputation and destiny. And that is the religious framework that I think lies at the heart of a lot of other religious traditions out there, not just Confucianism, but I think it's in there in Greek paganism as well. And I think that changed sometime around Aeschylus writing the Oresteia trilogy, but I'll have to do some more research on that. And it exists in the cult of the dead around Odin, which is actually an ancestor worship cult, related to the hero cults of the early Proto-Greek world and of the Indo-European world, from which it was derived. So there's a long history of it, and this is not just obviously Indo-European, if we can see it in Chinese Confucianism too. So I've got my own, and I was hoping, after laying out the framework here, I don't know how many of the 3 or 4 people watching here have read the book. It shouldn't be necessary with this little background, but if any of you had questions or criticisms or ideas, like how would this be implemented? How would you actually go about doing this? What about the danger of, this is one I was reading about earlier today, what about the danger of, blood feuds? So much of the advantage of Christianity seems to be the problem if you're living in a pastoral society, where a connection to your own tribe is critical. There are incentives to avenge your family if not only are they wronged, but if you perceive that someone was wronged. And that can lead into spirals of death and destruction. And so not only was the Athenian implementation of a legal court system, which is detailed in Aeschylus's writings, an attempted solution to that, but I think Christianity might be a big proposed solution to that as well. And it does that by separating you from your family and saying you are not actually a part of this greater lineage. You're not a part of this other thing. You are your own individual person with your own unique soul, and you have dignity as an individual that is disconnected from what you do, even, and disconnected from your honor and so forth. And in doing this, it both destroys the family in a like religious sense, and also extends the family to incorporate everyone in the world, well, at least everyone who is a believer in the world. There are a few passages in the Bible where Paul opens to Timothy, my true brother in Christ. And of course, priests are sometimes called fathers, and nuns are called mothers, and everyone is a child of a particular priest or nun, or so forth. So it is a changing of the family, the nature of the family, and it's very effective at reducing blood feuds in that way. But there's a huge cost to that, and I think that the modern dilution of identity, and so much of marketing that we see today, brand marketing from REI or Home Depot, it's all about trying to, it's like that line in Fight Club where Tyler Durden is like, what set of kitchenware defines me as a person? And he got the little glass bowls with the bubbles in them to prove that they're handcrafted or whatever. So much of that preys upon the lack of identity that we feel, because the invented identity of Christianity, for many people, isn't quite enough. At least not, relative to what is experienced in the more communal proximity that you see in somewhere like Okinawa, Japan, or Sardinia, places that are nominally Christian, but where the heartbeat of communal life in proximity to older and younger generations of your lineage really is the stronger religion. So I'm curious if anyone has any comments or questions. Because this doesn't seem to be it seems to be something everyone's kind of moving around the edge of, but not quite getting to the heart of. I see a little bit of allusions to this in Chuck Palahniuk's recent novel too, Adjustment Day. What is it? There is only the lineage, my grandfather and his grandfather, something like that. Yeah, a poetic way of putting it. Cool. And a medical mask face. Yes, it is important to wear the medical mask. If you have asthma or are old or smoke. Let's see. No questions at all. Well, if there aren't any current questions, I'll just riff on why I think this is relevant relative to one option I didn't list, which is atheism. And of course, the problem with atheism is that atheism proper is not helpful at all. It just doesn't give anyone any direction whatsoever. Now, what atheism masked in the mid-2000s, when the Four Horsemen were really popular. Full disclosure, I am still a huge Christopher Hitchens fan, even though I disagree with him on many things. But it was a mask for a kind of scientific utilitarianism, which is ironically actually not that different from Christianity in its spirit. It's just Christianity devoid of the theological basis for Christianity. So it still thinks that everyone is equal and are individuals endowed with inalienable rights, which is to say unalienable dignity, which theologically is grounded in the fact that we are all sinners and we are all made in the image of God. But when you divorce these liberal beliefs from Christianity, there's actually no there. The main difference between paganism or Christianity. Who's in the right? Which way forward? So we were discussing this a little bit earlier. My opinion is that Christianity is just factually wrong, which wouldn't, this sounds weird to say, which wouldn't be that big of a problem for itself, except that it makes truth so critically important. Paul at one point says, and if Jesus Christ has not risen from the grave, all our faith is in vain. I wrote at length about this in my book, which you can find on Amazon. But I mean, the problem is that it isn't true. And the spirituality of Christianity is designed around the assumption that it is true. And the it in that sentence is that there is a heaven and there is a hell. And in the meantime, this transitory period that we spend in the vale of tears here on earth is more or less irrelevant, except to the degree that it shapes our spirit and directs us in doing so towards heaven or not heaven. And so people will still sometimes be persuaded by Pascal's wager and say, like, oh, well, you got nothing to lose by believing in it, but you've got everything to lose by not believing in it, so you may as well believe in it. But that's not true at all. There, you do have something to lose by believing in it, and it's a lot more subtle to pick up, because the imagined loss, if it is true and you don't believe in it, is so many orders of magnitude greater that what is lost by falsely believing it seems petty in comparison. But when you factor in the odds, it's still a bad call. And what is lost is that connection to your lineage, the connection to your family and your nation and the traditions that build those things. And it's very easy for people to say, well, look at all the Christian countries that still have these connections and so forth. Well, sure, but that is in spite of their Christianity, not because of it. And the more pure you get in your Christianity, and the direction of Christianity will always be towards greater purity, the less you're going to have that. And that's made repeatedly explicit in the text itself. So that's a huge difference between paganism and Christianity. Paganism is the opposite. It treats your family and your lineage kind of as not a god usually, but as something to be respected. And there's customs of hospitality and also retribution related to the family. And certain gods, in the Greek tradition, Zeus in particular, really reward people who show dedication to their family and punish people who fail in their obligations in that direction. But the main problem with Christianity today, I think, is that the pagan traditions we are most accustomed to thinking about, the Hellenic ones and the Nordic ones, are largely dead traditions. There are, I guess we could call them necromancers, people out there trying to bring back these dead gods, to reanimate these things. But what they're really trying to do is to create something out of a text. They're trying to create Thor out of what they can read about Thor. And that's a very difficult thing to do. I'm not going to say it's impossible. And you can certainly derive a lot of inspiration for the proper way to go about implementing a more Anwei-oriented religious life from these things. The practices of libations, and you can go to even modern like kung fu schools in China and even other people's houses. And they have all these pictures of their ancestors up just on the wall around a family altar with some incense and stuff. That's classical ancestor worship, albeit in a Chinese tradition. That's a living tradition. Um, Nordic and Greek paganism are dead traditions. And I think that's the big problem that a lot of people have with those. So the advantage of the Anwei as a center, other than, you know, more traditional pagan systems or Christianity, is that, well, not Christianity, but instead of paganism, is that, you know, the basis is your family. You know, and for many people that's not much to start with, but it's at least something. You can dig through the books written by your grandparents and your great grandparents or about them. You can look at the pictures, go to their graves, visit where they were buried, where they went, um, and try to understand their mind and connect with their mind. And it's through that connection that you can begin to see what is natural and inborn in yourself, what you truly are, as opposed to what has been added by your environment. And I'm not trying to criticize those additions, because we are adaptive creatures. You know, it is right for us to change and morph and be like water, as Bruce Lee said, you know, and adapt to our environment. That's one of the critical reasons that we have to die, because it becomes really hard to change once we get set in our ways. But the world keeps changing, and the new generation is here to come and replace us, and they will adapt to the changing environments so that the lineage can live on. We've done our part. We've put them into existence, and hopefully given them a world with some, you know, advantages tossed their direction. So the difference, I think, between paganism and Christianity, to return to Pill Eater's question, is that um, you know, Christianity is tunnel vision. It is solipsistic. Don't worry about anything, just worry about God. And if you do that, then everything else will fall into place. Whereas paganism says, no, that's not quite right. You need to pay attention to lots of different things. And if you don't pay attention to one God because you're paying too much attention to these other ones, then something might go wrong related to that. And I think that paganism is uh, more close to the truth because Christianity is explicitly wrong. Where paganism can be interpreted as wrong is when people take the symbolism and the anthropomorphization too literally. Um, but the reason that Christianity goes astray now, I think we can see in the immigration crisis we've been experiencing, which is now the interconnected world, because the Christian spirit says we are all, at least in potential, one family, which is just biologically false, but existentially true for Christianity, because we are all created in the image of God, we are all sons of Adam, and for that reason we are all sinners. So there's no reason to prefer one's own countrymen over someone from Africa or Japan or some obscure part of Europe, for example. And I think, you know, to make it more relevant today, a large part of the problem with coronavirus has to do with this idea that we are all really one. We're not. We're not. And this highly connected world leads to a very, very connected network for pathogens to spread, which is, I mean, literarily interesting, because I've been doing a lot of research into the world of Homer recently, and what's the punishment that Apollo sends on the Achaeans for not properly respecting his authority? It's a plague that kills a lot of people. Plagues are a very common form of nemesis, of divine retribution for hubris, for violating the natural order in some way. And I think the modern global world was trying to build a Tower of Babel, to borrow some biblical literature, and this is why that doesn't work. So, anyways, short answer, paganism is right, and I think it's the better foundation for a way forward, but it's the pagan spirit, not any particular kind of paganism. One, because most pagan traditions in Europe are dead. We need to make our own to start the world, as Jack Donovan would say. And two, because the different places will practice paganism differently, or at least they should. Is coronavirus more than social control? I think it's its own thing. People will certainly try to use it as an excuse for more control. Um, they're gonna try to take as much, as many miles as they can from this inch that they've been offered. But I mean, that's, I think, incidental. I think the real problem is people are really afraid of watching hundreds of thousands of people die. And why shouldn't they be afraid of that? No one wants to see their grandpa die. No one wants to see their friend with asthma keel over. Um, it's just a byproduct of being very, very highly connected. Italy was so hard hit by coronavirus because it does a lot of trading with China. And also a lot of people smoke there. China is being super, super badly hit. They're almost certainly lying about the numbers of people dying over there. That seems like a pretty hefty price to pay for social control. Because if your aim is social control, you don't want to kill off large numbers of the people you're trying to control. What's the point of that? But that's just my opinion. I don't know. There's a lot we don't know about coronavirus. I think the big answer though to social control is to really pay less attention to a lot of this. And that sounds so counterintuitive and offends a lot of people. But the news and politics has become a quasi-religious thing. People sit down in front of their televisions, they turn on to Rachel Maddow or Tucker Carlson or whoever is there to outrage them. And it's kind of like watching a Greek tragedy. It's they sit down to vicariously experience the feeling of being smart and informed, all while having information spun and manipulated at them. They're not being informed by this. They're being herded in a particular direction. And it's maybe this way one day and that way another. And I don't think there's some grand plan to it all. I think it's really just, corporate shareholders trying to maximize profit in viewership. But it's still not like, that's not a good use of your time. If you're participating in politics to make your own life better, you would be way better off just avoiding that psychological trap of outrage that they're laying for you and just focusing on reading or getting more sleep or learning more about your work or growing a garden, spending more time with your family. Any number of things could have a tenfold greater impact on your life than making sure the next person that gets elected in your state senate is someone who you agree with. That's not helpful. And I think Pill Eater is right. There is I don't think it's just social control. I think it's a lot more than social control. But there's definitely an element of that going on. And part of that, and here the Christians are right, is the spiritual void, I think, in many people's lives in this kind of default atheist world, is they'll take in all kinds of poorly thought through idols in place of God or in place of the pantheon. And so that might be Tucker Carlson. There's a great image from who's the author? The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, Haruki Murakami. The protagonist, Toru Okada, is going to see this seer to try to find his lost cat, and eventually his wife who disappeared. And the seer he goes to see has this like this altar set up in his house, except instead of like incense or pictures or something, this is the way that modern Americans in particular, though I think in Europe it's probably similar, I don't know. I think that's how their religious life works. If worship is, paying positive attention to something, looking at something as being worth. The worship etymologically comes from the quality of worthship, being worth paying attention to. In that broader sense of the term, we kind of do worship the news. We worship, politics. We worship all kinds of outrage fodder, and that's where the social control comes from. We give it to them. So spend more time with your family, or if you're Christian, with the Bible, reading about God and so forth. Or in my case, reading about your family lineage and your spouse's family lineage. Learn what they're really all about. Because if you don't know what their family did, then they're going to catch you by total surprise if you think you know who they are based on what they've already done. And then some big life change happens and they're now suddenly a completely different person. You're like, who is this? It's like, well, yeah, people go through stages. And if you knew what their parents did when they hit that stage, or their grandparents did when you hit that stage, you'd have a better idea of what they would be like going through that phase yourself. You can be better prepared. I might write something about this. There's a lot of connections you can make. Actually, I'll just link the recent post I did here from Homer's writing in the Iliad and the Odyssey to this idea of connection to the family lineage in there. The insanity of not just Agamemnon, but his entire family tree comes from a profound disconnection with each other. And by disconnection, in their case, I mean fathers killing sons and sons killing fathers and so forth, and eating them, just to make matters worse. Whereas, Achilles, who had been overcome with rage and sadness and just couldn't shake it, is finally able to let go of his wrath when King Priam comes to ask for the body of Hector back. And what's particularly interesting about this very famous scene is the way in which it happens. Because he doesn't just say, have pity on me, and please give me my son back, it's the right thing. He does say all that. But what he says that's critical is, look at me. I am a father who has lost all 50 of my sons. Priam was a very, he was a very prolific king, we'll say. He says, I've lost all of my sons. You've killed most of them. Have pity on me, but have pity on your own father, Achilles. Have pity on Peleus, who's probably at home and doesn't know what's become of you, who probably thinks he's dead. I am like him. And at that moment, Priam is weeping for his dead son Hector, and Achilles begins weeping too, but not for Priam or for Hector, but for his own father. And the realization that his father is waiting for him to come home and he probably will never see him again. And it's that moment of connection that really turns Achilles into a man. Before that point, he was really a very capable warrior, absolutely brutal killer, but fundamentally an adolescent. He was still, and it was acting like an adolescent, in the way that he dealt with people. And so it was, I think, in that moment, you could say that he truly becomes a man. And then we move to the Odyssey, and we see a similar thing. The Odyssey opens by saying, "Man, tell me, muses, of this man of many turning directions," and so forth. And this is a guy who, he travels the world. He's been everywhere. He's come to know all different kinds of people. And the scene that comes to my mind is there's a movie. God, what was that movie called? It was like wasn't Killing Lions. It was like The Lion That Roared or something. But there's someone in the comments I'm sure can remind me. But there was a scene where there's these two old men and a young boy in a bar, and they're just kind of talking and hanging out quietly. And this gang of young thugs kind of comes in and start to push around the old man. And the old man gets up and grabs one of them by the throat. He says, "I've, traveled the world. I've invaded countries, and I've loved one woman. Get out of here, you freaking, like that old man who is sort of the quintessence of the Western ideal of what it means to be a masculine man in the best positive sense. That's Odysseus, But even Odysseus, who is worried about losing his mind out at sea and losing his way, finally manages to come back because, as the gods observed, he's so dedicated to coming home. He's so passionate about returning home. He's so committed to not forgetting to return home. And of course, returning home, the nostos, is not just physical returning home. Of course, it's obviously that as well in the story, but it's a mental thing. It's a mental return home. And that's sort of clarified symbolically when he reunites not just with his son, who is Telemachus, who is also pursuing Odysseus, but he reunites with his own father as well in the orchard, before they kill off the suitors together. That's what gives him his power, but also his sanity and ultimately his happiness, is that connection with your people, who are primarily your lineage, though it could include friends and so forth as well. And that's, of course, within the context of a pagan worldview. So I don't think paganism and this concept of the Anwei are mutually exclusive. But I don't know what sort of living pagan tradition we could mix with that in the United States. I live in America. I don't know where the viewers here live. Any other questions? I might just call it a night. It's been going for just about 50 minutes. I'll give it a few more minutes. If you guys do want to check out these books, I think Letter Anwei is probably, ironically, my most controversial book, even though In Defense of Hatred gets all of the hate. But if you want to learn more about my opinions about Christianity, and there's some stuff on paganism in there as well. I can't recommend Holy Nihilism enough. This is probably the best book I wrote, and you can learn more about it there. I have presented these ideas to a number of Christian friends and a few priests and a theologian, and no one really had any good answers. I'm sure someone will come up with something at some point. I'm still waiting. So good night, Pill Eater. Thanks for hanging out. If no one has any other questions or ideas, I'll probably call it a night too. But maybe we'll do this again some other time if people are bored and tired of being at home with nothing to do. So Yeah, I'll call that good. Take care. Good night, everyone. We'll chat more later.